Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Dr. Carol Christine Fair, who is an associate professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. Her work is primarily focused on counterterrorism and South Asian topics. She was a political officer with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan and is a senior research associate at USIP's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She has served as a senior fellow at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center and a senior resident fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. Welcome, Christine.
Oh, thank you.
I want to start with some of your older papers, and these are all focused on Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to start with the one from 2012, and it's entitled Faith or Doctrine, Religion and Support for Political Violence in Pakistan, in which you say, around the world, publics confronted with terrorism have debated whether Islamic faith gives rise to a uniquely virulent strain of non-state violence targeted at civilians. These discussions almost always conceive of Islam in general terms, not clearly defining what is meant by Islamic religious faith. You want to talk a bit about that paper and the data that you might have used to get to some interesting conclusions?
Yeah, thank you. Although I do want to tell you, actually, I've been promoted. I'm now officially a full professor.
I'm sorry about that.
No, you wouldn't know. So this, as you said, this was, it was published in 2016, but it was actually, because these things just take forever, right, to go through review and so forth. So that it was probably one of the first papers where we began looking at this question, although we have had more recent and more sophisticated attacks at this Puzzle. But yeah. This paper was really trying to figure out, this, if you look at the way the team is composed, you have basically Neil and Jake. They are quantitative political scientists. And the paper came out of sort of my intuition, having spent a lot of time in Pakistan. And for that matter, I did my dissertation on the Khalistan insurgency. And there are a lot of similarities, actually, between the verbiage and the ideology and the ways of imagining violence between Khalistanis as well as many jihadis. And my intuition was, this isn't about faith. This isn't about piety. There's something else going on. And what had particularly concerned me was that not only outside of Pakistan, but also within Pakistan, people began using shorthand to sort of make assumptions about people based upon how they were dressed. So, for example, if you saw that a woman, for example, was wearing the niqab, typically
Yeah.
worn by Salafists, people would assume that this woman must be more supportive of terror. Or
Mm,
men who were wearing their pants, including their suits, to be above their ankles, and wearing the beard that Salafists wear, which typically doesn't have a mustache, for example.
mm,
And so not only did people, for example, in the U.S. government, I would be with American officials, and they would say things like, "Well, I think this is a sign of radicalization." But even
mm,
within Pakistan, the people who chose not to uh, wear their piety, if you will, began fearing those who did, and
mm,
those who do wear their piety in their clothing also began to other those who didn't. And so I thought it was really appropriate whether for us to begin empirically testing some of those assumptions.
mm.
And so, yeah, and this paper comes to the conclusion it has really nothing to do with your piety. It really has to do with the content of your belief, not
Mm.
the depth of your belief.
So you say in the paper, Christine, that you looked at sort of separately considered the relationship between support for militant organizations and religious practice, number one, support for political Islam, number two, and jihadism, number three. And those three factors. So clothing is one thing, but there are other things that you considered, right?
Yeah, so I will say, so this was probably, since this was the first paper where we were
Yeah,
exploring it, I would certainly say this is our least sophisticated attempt at tweezing
yeah,
this out, because we were also, my colleagues were really interested in using indirect information gathering called the information queue to assess people's beliefs.
mm,
So the data set was about 9,000 people, but a lot of that sample size was driven by the fact that when you do an information queue experiment, you have to divide the populations into a treated and an untreated group. And you are also measuring support for militancy indirectly. So, for example, we would ask about madrasa policy, and the
mm,
untreated group would simply be asked, do they favor the current reforms under discussion? And the
yeah,
treated group would get an information and an endorsement from one of the militant leaders or organizations. And
mm,
so that way the person thinks that they're answering a policy question, and what we're really measuring on average is the way in which the endorsement changes the average level of support for the group between the treated and the untreated group. So that does mean that you're not getting. It's difficult to look at any one individual without comparing the means, if that makes sense. So
right.
what we did in subsequent papers, we really used this study to burrow deeper within this. But the intuition behind the breaking out of those issues are actually the debates that I've been studying for a long time amongst the different militant groups operating in Pakistan. So, for example, one of the first and foremost questions about this is whether or not you think jihad can be waged in an Islamically appropriate way by a non-state actor. Now,
Mm,
this is a huge debate, right? Across different Muslim scholars, and particularly amongst the Islamic, uh, the ulama communities,
yeah,
right? And this, you'll have these very complicated debates about when the Prophet was in Mecca. He used peace agreements. He only used violence when he went to Medina. And so you'll hear people talk about the Meccan and the Medinan period. But what's
mm,
central to those debates is whether or not jihad can be waged by a non state actor, or whether it can only be waged by an Islamic state. Then, of course,
mm,
there's a subsidiary debate about what an Islamic state is. The second issue concerns political Islam itself. And political Islam, simply, I would say, as an American, it's really not that different from the Republican efforts to stuff our courts with, well, no, I mean, I don't mean that humorously. I mean, right? I mean,
Yeah.
basically, what political Islam says is that we want our government to espouse Islamic ideals and adhere to prescriptions and proscriptions that are in the Quran. So, Americans will reduce this to Sharia simplistically. And I do point out that's why so many people are voting for President Trump, Mitch McConnell, because they are going to be continuing their effort of putting in justices who believe that there's a place for religion in our government, that women's bodies should be controlled by a government that adheres, respects to, and follows what they believe to be their interpretation of Christianity. Although the Bible, of course, never speaks to the issue of abortion except obliquely in the Old Testament when it actually condones abortion. It's a very limited reference. And you have the same situation with Sharia. And so Pakistan is very different from Iran. And of course, Iran is very different from Shia Islam elsewhere in the sense that in Iran, Shia Islam is very hierarchical, right? There's a clergy which is hierarchical. In Pakistan, there are 5 major traditions that interpret Sharia differently, and they are not hierarchical. So this is perhaps one of the things that keeps Pakistan from becoming an Islamic state. And part of that, and then of course the military, which really wants to be in control of the politics of Islam and the contents of political Islam, they're very effective at putting these different militant groups in contestation with each other based upon their competing ideologies. So,
so that diversity actually, if I understand this correctly, Christy, so that the diversity in interpretations actually provides them an avenue out of becoming a pure Islamic
absolutely.
state.
And it gives a lot of power actually to the military, which is all by design. I mean, this goes back to Pakistan's first army chief and first military dictator, Ayub Khan. The military wants to be in charge of the content of political Islam. And so having this non-hierarchical ulama arrangement is really quite suitable. But, you have a very similar situation in Afghanistan. And when you're in this business long enough, you kind of develop a colorful sense of humor or an off-color sense of humor. So one of the debates that the Taliban have been having is whose Sharia is going to prevail, because the school of Islamic thought to which the Taliban adhere is actually a minority. And so they're Deobandi, the majority of Afghans, we believe, because there hasn't been a census, oh my gosh, since before the 70s. Most Afghans are suspected to adhere to a Sufi order, Naqshbandi. And so while they're both Hanafi, they really are quite different in how they view the Prophet, how they view appropriate pietic practices. They both agree that, women are second-class citizens. So at least on the issues of oppressing women, they are in agreement, but on everything else, they disagree.
Right. And so I understand this is an older paper, and we'll come to some of the newer ones, but a couple of conclusions that came out of it, both are interesting. So you say that we find that neither religious practice nor support for political Islam is related to support for militant groups. That is sort of conclusion number one. Another one, I want you to quickly interpret this for me. So Pakistanis who believe jihad is both an external militarized struggle, that it can be waged by individuals, are more supportive of violent groups than those who believe it as an internal struggle of righteousness. And so if I understand this correctly, you're saying that whoever is believing this, could be, and I think you mentioned this, could be waged by individuals, not by the
Exactly.
state, are more supportive of the
Yeah.
violence
And
again. Yeah.
so
Okay.
so to go back to the first two conclusions, right? That people who
Yeah.
for example, believe in political Islam. I mean, you might be a very fundamentalist Christian in this country, right? You might completely support a Supreme Court that denies women access to body autonomy and the right to make choices about their bodies. But it does not mean that you would support those organizations, for example, who have shot at physicians that they believe to perform surgical abortion procedures, right?
Mm.
That is to say, you can feel about something very, very strongly, but you do not condone that violence, and you certainly wouldn't entertain that violence for yourself, right? So
Right.
this is exactly how Pakistanis are. Americans, I think, in particular, should be able to understand. And since I'm an American, I can only make that comparison. I can't make it to other countries. But I think the question is pretty straightforward. And so what we find is also very straightforward, and it derives explicitly from these different debates about the Quran. So we talked about the Meccan and the Medinan period, which is precisely the justification for the argument that only Islamic states, not individuals, can wage war. But there's also another set of debates that are derived from different surahs in the Quran. But there is this discussion about whether, because jihad just means struggle, right? It doesn't mean fight. It means means to struggle. And ijtihad, which is this process of interpretation, I often explain it. We don't. For Talmud scholars, right? It's basically trying to apply what is in the scripture to contemporary life, right? So it is that struggle to make sense. So there is a debate about whether or not the most important jihad is the jihad that you wage with yourself to become a better person or to make your society better. And then there are those who say, no, jihad is a militarized struggle. It comes directly from the same period in the Prophet's life when he commanded Muslims to pray 5 times a day, to pay zakat, and to undertake Hajj. And Muslims have readily embraced those obligations that were issued during the Medinan period, the so-called Islamic State period, and for them to repudiate the obligations of jihad is injurious to their commitments to Islam. So there are these two, but they're related, obviously, inherently, although they come from different pieces of the Quran. And another version of the greater lesser jihad is whether jihad is of the tongue, pen, or the sword. So in other surveys that I've done, for example, in Bangladesh, where that debate, where that phraseology is more salient, we use that version of the question. But they're coming from the same place.
Right. Yeah, so I want to go into another theme here. So you had an older paper. This is talking about poverty and militant politics and what the relationship might be. So the older paper in 2012, you say policy debates on strategies to end extremist violence frequently cite poverty as a root cause of support for the perpetrating groups. But you found in 2012 there is little evidence to support this contention, using again data from Pakistan. And you have a recent paper in 2016 entitled Relative Poverty, Perceived Violence, and Support for Militant Politics. Again, evidence from Pakistan, where you're finding something slightly different, right? Do I understand that correctly?
What both of these things have in common is it is not the poorest of people that support these groups, right? And now, I mean, since this is a science podcast, right? There is a statistical process happening here. It might surprise most of your readership because of the prominence of the so-called global war on terrorism that, up until as late as 2010, many, which is, and certainly 2011 with Osama bin Laden being found in Pakistan, many Pakistanis did not even believe that Al-Qaeda was even real. And, I'd been going to Pakistan long before 9/11. I first went to Pakistan in 1991. Now, this is quite distinct from the indigenous Pakistani groups. So the people who are going to know, so first thing, political Islam, at least in Pakistan, is an urban phenomenon, right? And the groups in Pakistan, like, for example, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Al-Qaeda, so many researchers are fascinated with online presence. But the fact is, in Pakistan, there's so little penetration of the internet, even still, that these groups rely upon the good old-fashioned printed word, right? So by the time you start asking who's going to be knowledgeable of these groups, who's going to know what their position is, you're really looking at someone who is generally urban, who is going to have the group I primarily study, Lashkar-e-Taiba, writes very sophisticated materials. This is not stuff for your country bumpkin. Now, there are terrorist publications that cater, but you still have to be literate, right?
Correct. You need access to, sounds like you need access to information.
Right? And so, so that there is this self-selecting process of people who tend to be better educated, and they're less likely to be poor because they have to be able to buy this stuff, right? And so that's, I think, now there's another way of approaching this that I've also looked at. So I think of the militant market as having two dimensions, like any other labor market. There's the demand for jihadi labor, right? And then there's the supply of jihadi paper. And the reason why we do studies like this, where we're using surveys, is that there's this presumption that presumably if you're going to be willing to send your kid to jihad or even undertake jihad yourself, that there has to be some level of support for it, right? And we can debate that. There actually we have done studies of this in the U.S. Army, incidentally, and it turns out the people who, there's this thing, they're monitoring the youth aptitude survey. There have been a couple surveys that people have used to anticipate future Army recruitment goals. And it turns out the majority of people that join the Army are the people who said, I'm never going to join the Army, right? Now, part of that's statistical right. Because most people say, I'm never going to join the Army. And then lo and behold, they join the Army. So different people have different philosophies. I do not personally believe, and it has not been shown, that just because you support these groups, that this means that you will support yourself going, right? I mean, I've spent too much time at RAND and have learned too much about Army recruitment and how unreliable those surveys are to believe they work like this. But they do speak to public support, right? If people don't support them, they don't give money, they would not consider sending their kid to jihad. So these surveys in some way or another speak to potentially the supply of terrorist labor. But when we look at the puzzle from the other way and we look at the demand piece, we're still coming to an interesting conclusion about the poorest people. They are not the people who are showing up in terrorist ranks. And so a colleague of mine, Ethan Bueno de Mosquita, he's really he was more of a theoretical economist, although he's done much more empirical work subsequent to writing this piece. He wrote this really interesting piece called The Quality of Terror. And he was trying to understand this puzzle, which is to say, generally poorer countries are more likely to produce terrorists, but the terrorists themselves are not likely to be poor. Right. And so he theorized that when you have a fairly lousy economy, higher quality people are unemployed, and thus higher quality people's opportunity costs decline in a retrenching economy. And since terrorist organizations tend to be small numbers, right? There's usually,
Right.
as long
Right.
as there are more people who want to be a terrorist than there are needs for terrorists, they can choose on quality, right? So in my own work on Pakistan, I have found empirical support for that claim. Now, again, the reason for this is really quite simple. It really hinges upon, I mean, so you can sort of say, I've spent too much of my life working with labor economists, so I tend to approach these puzzles like a labor economist. But so if this first dawned on me, I might add, around 2002, because everyone was like howling and screaming about madrasas, and I was in Kashmir actually with the Indian Army, which obviously makes me, a Muslim hater. Just ask. Actually, everyone hates me. The Hindu nationalists hate me. The ISI lovers hate me, and our own religious nationalists hate me. I get no love. But I was there with them. I was with the 15th Corps, and they showed me these training notebooks that the militants, just like they're in school. When my brothers were in the Army until recently, when they went through their various training, they took notes on what they had to do and what they had to learn. And I'm looking at these notebooks, and they're doing math. Of course, they're doing math, because if you're going to build an IED from things that are available in the market, you have to know how to do. You need to know how to do ratios, right? And they had to identify the English words for the compounds. And I'm looking at this. I'm like, man, these kids are not coming from these madrasas, because madrasas don't teach this, right? And that ended up driving the work I did on madrasas. But go on. Right.
Yeah. No. Would you say then, there's sort of an inverted U-type relationship. So if you think about income on the x-axis, on the supply side, you have to be reasonably well off. You have some spare time to spend, so to speak, and
you have to be literate, which is really
and
a major cutoff in Pakistan, right? The majority of Pakistani males will not get to the 10th grade, right? That is a major accomplishment. And that is the minimum level of literacy that you would need to understand most of the materials that I have studied, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is a very, very interesting. So it has a lot of policy implications. I want to touch on another theme that you have in a couple of papers, one older one and one more recent one. And that's about the connection or the correlation, if you will, between democratic values and militant politics.
It's not what people think.
There are some counterintuitive
but no, it's not counterintuitive for me. It was counterintuitive. It was counterintuitive for my colleagues. But remember, I'm the regional person, right? So I spent 30 years in South Asia. So for me, there was no counterintuitiveness. Right. And if you think it through, it's not counterintuitive. So so in South Asia, Azadi, right? It means independence. It was associated with the independence movement, right? That resulted in an independent India and Pakistan, although that was not entirely desired by all in the subcontinent. So, and then even prior to, you had the mutiny of 1857, and whether you're Indian or Pakistani today, you generally still recognize that as the first war for Azadi, right? So Azadi means freedom. If you think about the American Revolution, what were we weren't fighting for the right to tax corporations or not tax corporations, right? We were fighting for Azadi.
Yeah.
And so my intuition was, and so my role in these papers is to basically kind of think about the division of labor. They're the science gurus. They know how to do the experimental surveys. my job is to look at the literature, combine it with what is known or not known about South Asia to produce testable hypotheses, right? And so it's very rare that you have teams like this. That's the first thing. Like, we are very, very unique in our team. So, and we were able to explore things that other people hadn't conceived of, because most teams are not as interdisciplinary as we are and were. So let's take, for example, the groups that we looked at. I had hypothesized that the groups that support Azadi or profess to support Azadi will be supported by those groups that fare well in support for democracy measures, right? Those groups that do not espouse an Azadi objective will not enjoy that support amongst democracy supporters. So I can give you like a couple of examples. The Taliban, when we did this survey, they were espousing Azadi from U.S. occupation. And that's how they're depicted in Pakistan. You know, remember, there's a subjective truth about what the groups actually do and what the groups say they do. And because of the disinformation management campaigns that are skillfully waged by Pakistan's intelligence agency, the quality of information that people have about what the groups actually do is quite low. So the most important thing is that they think they do this. So I had hypothesized that groups like the Taliban, the jihadi groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, they argue that they are helping Kashmiris, and for that matter, more generally, Indian Muslims, obtain Azadi from the Indian state. But there are other groups, like the sectarian groups, who primarily the public good, if you will, that they provide is not arguing against occupation and for Azadi, but simply ridding the community of what they see to be apostates, for example. Those groups should not register support among democracy supporters, because they are not tying there's nothing in their organization and the arguments that they espouse that appeal to fundamental democratic rights, right? And that's actually so that intuition is borne out empirically.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So as you mentioned, there are some close parallels.
Yes, of course. Oh my heavens, so many frighteningly close parallels.
Frighteningly, we will talk a little bit about that because you spend a lot of time in India and Pakistan as well as in the US. There are some very interesting parallels between these three countries in the contemporary sense. And I don't know if you have done much work in this area, Christine. I grew up in the
Kerala is a hot spot.
Kerala. So I spent half my life there.
Where in Kerala? Because that's also important. Are you from northern Kerala or for the southern part of Kerala?
I am in the middle.
So then you know what I'm talking about then, don't you? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, but when I was growing up, though, and when we come back, we'll talk about this. When I was growing up, as you know, it's a very multicultural society. Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. There was a significant Jewish population in that area that seemed to have mostly left that area. But when I was growing up, we used to go to all the festivals. We go to mosques and temples and churches. And we didn't really think about religion as a very customized luxury good. And so I think there are some parallels here in terms of the state had 100% literacy. It had some, sort of perhaps more developed ideas. And so I think you mentioned this. Education seems like a very important aspect, to get out of this nightmare that we are in. But we'll take a quick break, and when we come back. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. So Christine, you have some recent papers, and one of them is on Bangladesh. And this one is entitled, Who Supports Suicide Terrorism in Bangladesh? What the Data Say. In which you say Bangladesh, one of the world's largest Muslim countries, is generally viewed as a success story with a strong tradition of secular democracy. Unfortunately, you say this assertion rests on a weak empirical foundation. So you want to talk a bit about, again, the data and what you concluded?
Yeah, so you'll find people who like to have certain fantasies about Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And so for example, the most common one is that it is an example of a Muslim democracy, peace, secular democracy, all of this stuff. When you actually look at the history of Bangladesh, that just isn't true, right? It was a very brief period in Bangladesh's history right after it was liberated from Pakistan in the 71 war, where Bangladesh was truly a secular democracy. And it lasted all of like 4 years. And even in that period, Mujibur Rahman, who was viewed by, I will call them left of center Bangladeshis as the father of the nation, he was a horrific autocrat, rivaling only, I would say, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was his contemporary, right?
Right.
And you'll see almost from the beginning a rehabilitation of the various Islamist groups that many Bangladeshis had initially reviled because of their role in the anti-Bengali atrocities. So Jamaat Islami, for example. But they begin to be rehabilitated very briefly after independence. And what you kind of had like this blowback effect, like once Bangladesh was established, the Bengaliness of the country was not in question, right? But you had a lot of Bengali non-Muslims. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why East Pakistan was treated so terribly, was because of the Bengali, Hindu, as well as Christian and Buddhist citizens who were still then Pakistani. So Bangladesh basically feels comfortable that it got its Bangladesh state, its Bengali state, and it becomes much more interested in Islam issues. And part of this is facilitated by the rise of the petrodollar amongst Gulf state monarchies. Bangladesh, like many other Muslim, obviously not only Muslim states sent their employees to the Gulf for remittances, but this was a very natural place for South Asian Muslims to go. And that, by the way, does tie very much into the Kerala ISIS story.
Right.
So Bangladesh, this idea of it being a secular democracy is really just, it's going to be nice to call it a fiction. But whereas the Pakistani state has very much embraced jihadism as a tool of foreign policy under its nuclear umbrella, the current leadership in Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, her strategic value to the international community is that she is supposed to be a staunch foe of Islamism and Islamist militancy, right? In reality, she is doing what her predecessors have done, which is she's setting up her own statist Islamist organization that she can be in control of while trying to drive underground the groups. It's the groups that came before. So this is right out of the Pakistani page. So interestingly enough, because of this, doing this survey in Bangladesh was much more dangerous than the surveys we did in Pakistan. It comes the only other survey I've ever done that was as dangerous as the Bangladeshi one was a survey I did in Iran in 2007.
Yeah.
So the Sheikh Hasina regime picked up several of our enumerator teams. We had to We only collected half of our sample when the harassment became too intense. She then had her intelligence agency pick up one of my colleagues. I
Wow.
then spent me and Ali Riaz about 2 months trying to get him out. And then once we got him out of detention, get him out of the country, it became a part-time job for almost 9 months to get him resettled in a country where he could be safe. And then they did a similar thing to a junior colleague on the project. So, and the reason for that is that from Sheikh Hasina's point of view, any level of support for these militant groups and their tactics would damage her credentials, right, as a so-called secular strong woman.
So she was afraid what you will find.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And so I haven't really looked into this, Christine. So what's the composition of the Bangladesh population? I know it's about 160 million, and it's 90% Muslim or something along those lines.
Yeah, probably a little bit higher than that.
Yeah.
But most of the Hindus have been driven out, right? I mean, it's if you look at going back the partition of the Bengal, going back to the early 20th century, every single one of these major events, like the partition of Bengal, then of course partition of the subcontinent, then 1971, and then every time a Hindu fanatic in India did something like, massacre Muslims, the Ayodhya massacre, what happened in Ayodhya and the subsequent massacres, the Muslims in India, in Pakistan and Bangladesh would simply retaliate against the innocent, hapless Hindus there as if somehow it was their fault, right? So you've had like this, and then one of the things whenever I go to Dhaka, I always go to the Hindu temple because that's the best way of seeing whether or not people feel it's safe to be there. And the last time I was there, it was not well attended at all. And people that I did speak to, I said, "Hey, where is everyone?" And they're like, "Well, we're just afraid to be here," because some of the groups in Bangladesh, they've targeted secularists and they've targeted non-Muslims. So so there are.
So there's a sort of a self-selection bias. So if you let the experiment run long enough, you'll get pure countries, and we are close to that.
And of course Pakistan has waged an unrelenting war on its minorities. But the problem that you have in Bangladesh is somewhat similar to Pakistan. When you have these competing traditions of Sunni Islam, not to mention Shia, and then there's always the Ahmadi problem, you then have who is the right Muslim. So, for example, in Pakistan, but it happened in Bangladesh first, which I always pointed out to people. Even the Taliban did not do what I saw in Bangladesh. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, Bangladeshi militant groups were attacking Sufis, right? The Taliban did not do that in Afghanistan. And so, and the reason why they were going after Sufis, just as they are in Pakistan, is that the Barelvis, which, is like the name that's sort of the umbrella term for people who follow different Sufi traditions, they engage in practices that Orthodox Muslims believe to be heterodoxical and to be drawing from Hindu practice. So, for example, going to shrines and seeking out the advice and amulets and blessings and so forth from religious peers. They view this to be an accretion from Hinduism, and they want to extirpate it, right? So Bangladesh, you saw these things happening in Bangladesh more than 12 years or so before it first began happening in Pakistan with any regularity, right?
Yeah. So let's set aside Bangladesh. We'll return to that. You have a couple of other papers, again, looking at, so this is suicide bombing in West Africa. Again, you're looking at, there is a hypothesis that you say if a support for Islamist violence among Muslims can be found, then the probability of a terrorist attack could be higher. in that area. That's a hypothesis, right? So I guess in this paper, you didn't really find that to be the case,
Well, no.
right?
So that paper
Yeah.
and the Indonesia paper are what we call
Yeah.
replication studies. So
Okay. Okay.
my
Yeah.
colleagues Liz Nugent and Rebecca Littman, we did this paper in Political Science Research Methods, where we had put forward a more, what we believe to be a more accurate way of instrumentalizing support for terrorism, and it comes out of these different empirically verified measures of what people think Islamism is, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out, and again, it's in debates that are not so dissimilar from what's happening amongst Christians here. It's scriptural literalism, right? It's the scriptural literists who are
Right.
more likely to support this kind of violent terrorism. Even the first Bangladesh paper with Ali Hamza and Rebecca Heller, that too was a replication study. The first paper in Bangladesh, we're using Pew data, just as we used in Indonesia and just as we used in the West African countries. And the
Yeah.
other issue that made the West African cases interesting is that usually these surveys are done in Muslim majority countries, right? And so we're drawing from another paper I did with my colleague Parina Patel. We actually found that it's not just being Muslim, it's the kind of regime in which you live that affects your attitudes towards violence. And so we were trying to, what we had found in that paper is that the percentage, as the percentage of the population that's Muslim varies, so do attitudes towards violence. But not always in ways that are predictable, because so few of the surveys include, for example, India, the questions that we need about violence, as well as detailed questions about beliefs about Islam, they're never fielded in India, even though India is one of the most important Muslim minority countries, right?
Yeah. I mean, it has more Muslims than Bangladesh.
Well, okay, so it kind of depends on the census,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So whose
Yeah.
censuses are worse? And right, so what we do know is that the populations of Pakistan, the Muslim populations of India and Indonesia, they are all pretty competitive, depending upon
Right.
whose census you think to be better or worse. But so the importance of including, so what we did was we had this scriptural literalness, right? That was the key finding that Rebecca and Liz and I found, and we wanted to see how far away from Pakistan can we go and still find that scriptural literalism, not other things, drive this result. And so it was very robust in Indonesia. It was very robust in Bangladesh. And, you know, it's generally robust in West Africa, which is surprising given how different those polities are. Because the Muslims in West Africa, they are not Hanafi like everyone is in South Asia. They tend to be
Right.
Hanbali, right? And they're not Muslim majority countries. So these would those would fall into what I would just call robustness or replication studies. How far can we take this principal finding and still have it hold up?
And so the finding is, if I understand this correctly, Christine, the finding is that scriptural
Yeah.
literalism is highly correlated with proclivity to
Yes,
violence.
exactly.
And you find that in the data, in replication studies across a variety of countries, Indonesia, Bangladesh, 4 West African countries, and more generally, if you look at India, we look at the US, we see something very similar in some ways, right?
So a couple of things about India and also the United States. We don't really have these kinds of data, right? We don't have comparable data. And the other thing about India that I always caution people is that there is more variation between 2 Indian states than there are, say, for example, between India and Bangladesh, depending upon your measure, right? 'Cause India is so ginormously complicated. And Muslims are not, so you grew up in Kerala, right? A Muslim in
Right.
Kerala has more affinity, despite even after all the changes that you've observed, than with another Kerala Hindu, than he or she will have with a Muslim from Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, much less Kashmir,
Right.
right?
Right.
There is no common language, right? And that's why so many Southern Indian Muslims wouldn't even consider moving to Pakistan in 1947. They didn't speak Urdu. Their eating habits were much more similar to their Hindu neighbors. Their clothing
Right.
habits completely different. No one wears in 47. No one wore shalwar kameez.
No. Yeah. Never seen that in
Never,
Canada.
right?
Yes. Right.
It's
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
recently,
Yeah.
and that's because of the Gulf migration. So India, for me, we have to be very careful, and we have to think about specific states. And there are some states that have had where Muslim parties were rehabilitated. For example, Kerala, after partition, Muslim parties were repudiated because of their association with communal violence. But in Kerala, so for example, the Ministry of Education has gone back and forth between Marxists and the Muslim League. And
Right.
both have invested very heavily in education, right? The
Yeah.
Muslim League in Kerala is a very professional political organization. And if you were to compare that
That's right.
to
Yeah.
its counterpart, for example, in Hyderabad, the Oasis, it's a very different kind of organization, right? For so many
That's right.
reasons. And I've spent a lot. I spent a lot of time studying both of these states and their political parties. And I had at one point had hoped to return to this study on, but it's just become too difficult to do this study in India in the current political environment in India.
So is a foundation there, Christine? Is it purely education that
So,
makes a difference,
all right,
or is something else?
here's what I would say is the here's the hypothesis that explains the Kerala phenomenon. It has not been, I don't think this has been, robustly empirically tested, but here's my hypothesis that I had hoped to go back and figure out. So we know from India's census, and again, it's really important that you look state by state because there's so much variation. But in general, when we look at human development indicators, Muslims they're either below OBCs in scheduled the other backward castes and scheduled tribes, or they are just somewhat above, but they're hovering. And this will depend on whether it's an urban area or a rural area. But in general, now, so you take a state like Kerala, everyone is going to be better educated in Kerala than, say, Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, because it's Kerala for all the reasons that we've talked about. Both Marxists believed, and so actually Amartya Sen did a really fascinating study back in the 90s. He was asking what states were best able to take advantage of the market reforms that that were made under Manmohan Singh when he was the finance minister. And what he actually found was Bengal and Kerala were better situated than most because the general Indian educational model is that they're not going to invest in basic education. They're going to basically cream the cream, and then the creamed cream goes to the IITs, right? And there are so many people. I mean, you can actually do that with a huge population like India because the population is so large, right? But what positioned Kerala to truly take advantage of the market reforms was that it had invested in basic health and basic education. So you had a more endowed labor pool. They had higher levels of human capital. And thus they were able to have, more effectively reap the rewards.
So if this
Oh no, but
hypothesis is
this
true,
isn't the
then
hypothesis about Kerala. So
yeah,
okay, so as I said,
okay,
Kerala. So
okay,
you have to sort of bear with me.
yeah,
So
yeah,
nonetheless, despite the fact that Muslims in Kerala are better educated than they are in their neighbors, there is still a hierarchy, right? They're still, when you look at their employment rate, when you look at their income, they still lag behind their higher caste Hindu counterparts. Okay, so what happens when you have a well educated pool of Muslim labor that is underemployed and speak English, which is the other, what makes Kerala so different? They go to the Gulf, right? And that's what they
right,
did. They had been going to the Gulf for a very long time. And they began, as they began making money in the Gulf, and this is, of course, referring to specific villages in the northern part of Kerala, they began
yeah,
investing in Islamic institutions, mosques, madrasas, all of this stuff. Um, you'll be in the middle of the jungle, and women are wearing a full hijab with niqab, and you'll go and
wow, wow, yeah. I haven't
oh,
been to
oh,
Northern Kerala
you
for 30 years, so I
if you
wouldn't
go
know.
back, you'll be
Yeah,
floored. You'll and again, this is not poor people because one of the things I always do, I always go into the hijab shops and I always see what's the cheapest hijab I can get. And that's a really good
right,
indicator of who's wearing hijab and who's not. And so if you were to go to Kerala now, you would find that people are less likely to inter celebrate these holidays that you spoke about. Um, the men still, I'm sure you know this, but in Kerala, Muslim men and Hindu men, they wear their lungis tied on other sides, right? So
right,
that's still generally the case. Visually, the only thing that might distinguish a Hindu from a Muslim in Kerala will be the presence or absence of a skull cap and a beard, of course, especially if they've done Hajj. But the big differences are going to be in the
right,
women. The women are going to be veiled from head to toe. And so what? So then what happens
wow,
is ISIS. People ask, well, why are these really educated Muslims joining ISIS? Well, it kind of goes back to the basic human capital. Think about this. Your average Indian has to have a lot of savoir faire to get a passport. And the first thing they need to do to go and join ISIS is to get a passport, which most Indians cannot do. You have to grease palms because you also have to have a police check. You have to get the primary documents. And most people don't, just like America, even though it's very simple, most Americans do not have passports. Most Indians don't have passports. And so what is
right,
really happening is that the there's no nice way to put this. The lethargy of India's bureaucracy puts this enormous selection pressure so that only the most savvy, competent, and endowed can get their passports to become an ISIS terrorist. That person in Bihar might want to join ISIS, but that poor dude, he
right.
can't figure out who to bribe to get his passport.
So that is the inverted U that we talked about before, right? So at either end of the sort of the wealth income spectrum, you don't have subscription to ISIS or
Yeah.
more generally violence. So it is those who are sort of in the middle who
And
have the
above. These are
luxury
some of the wealthiest. Some of these ISIS dudes
and
were
access.
were
Yeah,
Yahoo employees in the United States. Like these, I mean, these are
right,
not middle
right.
class by Indian standards. These are the elite of the elites. They made a choice. Yeah.
And so this has again, if you think about some sort of a policy intervention. So if I understand this correctly, Christine, just correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is that it doesn't really matter. We think about democracy, we think about education, are things could be cure to these problems that we discussed. But in absence of some sort of egalitarianism. I don't know what the right term would be, but if people are sort of left behind in the
Yes.
bureaucratic pyramids, in different echelons of the bureaucratic pyramids. They might be educated, they might have some affinity for democracy, but at the end of the day, the outcomes are not going to be what you
Yeah, I mean,
desire.
again, it depends upon the group, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
what now I got to be blunt. ISIS befuddles me, right? I don't know how it
Yeah.
is that any Muslim can look at ISIS and say, "Oh yeah, I totally want to be a part of that." I mean, it is, but it is not so dissimilar from something that I see in the United States. Although, so in the
Mm.
United States, there are women that are very happy being the Amy COVID Barretts of the world, or the Betsy DeVos.
Mm.
And the reason is they view themselves as sort of second in the hierarchy in the white male supremacist regime in which they operate, right?
Mm.
They're literally the handmaids of patriarchy. And they are endowed with the job of policing other women, and they derive their status from that, right? Many
Mm.
many men of color voted for Trump, right? And they
And
still will.
still,
And the reason for that is that whereas white
yeah.
women want more access to white privilege and whiteness, they want access to more patriarchy, right? And
Mm.
so if you think about the people who are living in the United Kingdom and hauling their kids off to Syria via Turkey, or trying to haul their kids off, you have to ask, what in the world is this regime that you think is so glorious? This is a murderous, terrible regime. But taking that parallel of
Mm.
white women who want to be the handmaidens of white male supremacy, or black men who are happy benefit or who are happy to support white male supremacy because it is male supremacy, right? And they are number two because they are males. In the same way, the middle class Bangladeshis in London, um, where are they in the status? Right, there is no social mobility in the United Kingdom. Even
Mm.
nouveau riche, they will still be identified as nouveau riche, which is very different from Americans. Like I'm from straight up trailer park. I am trailer park, and I'm not even embarrassed. I'm the American dream, right? My mother, I don't have a dad. My mom cleaned toilets, among other things, bartended to send me to college, and I'm a professor, right? That's the American dream.
Yeah.
In fact, if I were not so sensitive to my class origins and embrace it, people would never assume that I'm a hillbilly. It would never, and no one would really even care, right? That's not true in the UK. So if
Right.
you sort of, if you take a situation that you understand intuitively, as I do, the black male white supremacist supporters and the white females, it's very similar for this Bangladeshi in the United Kingdom. They will, no matter how much money they earn because of the work they've put in educating their children to become doctors, at the end of the day, when and I've seen this happen. I have lots of South Asian friends in the United Kingdom. I have been with them when we're just walking down the road and someone calls them a racial epithet, right? So you can
Mm.
see, the appeal of an otherwise unappealing regime, because this is a regime that empowers you. And it has enough people that you get to look down on and oppress, that you in fact feel empowered, right?
Mm. Yeah, so I want to dig a little deeper. So you have a recent paper here, 2020, just came out, Rational Islamists, Islamism and Regime Preferences in Bangladesh. But we can
Yes,
talk
yes, yes,
more
yes.
broadly about this. So you talk about a framework here, civilizationalist, modernizationist, and
Mhm.
rational choice. So what are those three
All right.
categories, and what do
So,
they mean?
so modernizationists. Well, let's just focus on what the puzzle is in Bangladesh first and foremost.
Yeah.
So, and this is a survey that we actually fielded. So it turns out, and again, it is counterintuitive what you think. The people who most support democracy in Bangladesh, guess what? They're not the secularists. They're the Islamists. They are people who identify as Islamists. Now, again, as the area studies person, I'm not surprised by this because I have seen it before. I've seen this in Pakistan. If you are a secularist, and oh, by the way, this also explains, there are comparable papers in the United States that explain support for autocracy among white people. Hang on, the parallel is striking. So in Bangladesh, if like, oh, gee, like, I don't expect Islamists to support democracy. Well, it's really quite simple. Islamists in Bangladesh are right now hunted, haunted, terrified, and disenfranchised by the Sheikh Hasina regime. Right? Every manner of depriving them of a right to vote is in practice. Secularists fear a truly free and fair election, including letting Islamist candidates contest elections, because they fear that they, in fact, will come back to power. So secularists prefer more autocracy, and the Islamists fear that if there were more democracy, they would be better represented. That's the Bangladesh puzzle, and that's what we find empirically, right? Wow. In the United States, we find the same thing. White people are perfectly happy supporting the autocratic tendencies of the current Republican Party, including voter suppression, gerrymandering, for the same reason, right? Because if everyone had a vote, our government would look more like us. We would not always be run by white men with some white women tossed in for good measure, right? So how do you protect that from happening? By anti-democratic policies. And so how ironic, right, that both Islamists in Bangladesh and proponents and preferences of proponents of white privilege in the United States want the same thing.
Same thing in India too, right?
I haven't seen studies on it, and so I'm one of those. Intuitively, I would absolutely. My gut tells me that but I haven't seen studies on it, and the data that it would take to do this would be very difficult to collect in India.
Right, because of diversity.
You would need such a humongous
so it is not,
that who would pay for it?
Right. And like you suggested, India remains to be perhaps, if not 26 countries, but at least five countries.
I mean, Uttar Pradesh itself is larger than most European countries. Right? People just like, Uttar Pradesh is like one of the biggest political entities in the world, right? So the size of India is daunting. And so, and to properly do this, we would really have to oversample many of the states that have larger Muslim populations than not. It would just, I mean, I've looked into this, and I can't get anyone to fund it because it's so prohibitive.
Yeah. And so a couple of conclusions out of this paper. So you say we find considerable support for modernist assertions that education and urbanization positively correlate with tastes for democracy, but we find little evidence that economic standing does. But we just talked about that taste for democracy is related to expecting different outcomes. If you take initial conditions, and you say, what's the best path toward what I want to accomplish? So that is what that really means. And so you also say that our findings lend strong support for rational choice approaches to this puzzle. Respondents who want more Sharia also prefer more democracy. So we talked about that. And while those who want more secularism actually want less democracy. So so on the surface it's counterintuitive, but as you described, it
Yes,
makes a lot of
yes,
intuitive sense actually once you
yes.
understand
Yeah,
the
exactly.
reasons why that's
Very few
happening.
things are truly counterintuitive. It's just that means people don't have very good intuition about the case. But like, so for example, like let's take hijab, right? It's one of my favorites because
Yeah.
unless you hang out and with a lot of and varied qualities where women wear hijab for different reasons, it's really easy to be very monotonal in your interpretation of it, right? But I mean, when I was a student,
Hmm.
a couple of, when was it, 2015? I was did an internship or whatever. They gave me some position at some think tank in Mumbai, and I like to run. So I would wake up really early, crack of dawn
Yeah.
before it got too hot because it was in the summer, and I would go running along Marine Drive.
Right.
At 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the
Yeah.
morning, I would see young ladies in their hijabs with their boyfriends. Now, I'm fairly confident that those
Hmm.
young ladies did not wake up at a quarter of five to take a marine beach stroll, right? And so, one of the things
Right.
that I'd been observing across South Asia, because I am a South Asianist, I can't speak to other parts in the Muslim world, just within South Asia. A lot of young
Yeah.
girls are dressing like this as social camouflage, right? The parents say, "Oh, my
Right.
baby, she would not run with the boys because look, dekho ji, hijab pehan kar bahar jati hai. She only goes outside in this hijab. She is such a right." And I saw the same thing in Pakistan when I was teaching at Lums and Lahore. The girls that I were more likely to
Right.
find at night making out around the track were the hijabis, right? Because they were wearing it as social
Hmm.
camouflage. Um, so there's just, and then there are these big debates among hijabi women. There's funny expressions like there's the hojabi and the half jabi, and the hojabi is the woman who wears her hijab to emphasize her sexuality. Or as one might say in Hindi, sab nazar aate
Hmm.
hain. You're wearing it, but I still see everything. Um, and so, in other words, a sexualization of the hijab. You have uh, models. You have
Hmm.
runways of hijabi fashion, right? It is just
Right.
so not straightforward how to interpret hijabs because they're being embraced for very different reasons. In India, some young persons
Right.
are espousing hijabs and skull caps because they in the same way that even wealthy African Americans they'll go to Macy's and buy a Macy's hoodie or Neiman Marcus or wherever rich people go to buy things. I'm not rich, so I don't know.
It's a
It's a fair
fashion. It's a
it's a
fashion
fashion statement
statement
that's
rather than anything.
associated
Yeah.
with your identity, right? When a wealthy
Right.
African American man goes to wherever wealthy people shop to buy his hoodie, what he is saying is, I at the end of the day, if a cop pulls me over because I'm driving while black, my money doesn't protect me because they think I've stolen this car, right? It's a statement. I can't buy
Hmm.
my way out of my identity, right? And so it's an identity
Hmm.
marker which has become a fashion statement.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
many Muslim youth in India are saying, I'm really tired of being told I have to blend in. I'm tired of being told I'm the one who has to assimilate when I see Hindu nationalism on the rise. And so they're deliberately espousing this identity,
Right.
not to be in your face, which is what many Hindus will interpret it as, because I've heard them complain. Why do they have to be so in your face about it? Um, but no one ever asks Hindu
Hmm.
nationalists, why are they so in your face about it? But what they're actually doing is that they're signaling to other Muslims that they're not alone. Right? It's a social solidarity.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's so you have been studying these problems in many parts of the world with a focus on South Asia. And so, in conclusion, let me ask you, Christine. So, based on everything that you know, based on all the trends that you see, um, where do you think these countries are heading? And we talked about Pakistan and Bangladesh in specific. We know what is happening in India more generally. We know what's happening in the US. Where do you think we are heading toward? If you predictions are always a dangerous game, but if you could speculate,
So,
5
I
years,
think
10 years from
Pakistan is
now, where do
pretty
you think we'll
clear.
end up?
I feel I've spent so much of my life in Pakistan, and it is so structurally overdetermined by the military. Um, so we're returning Afghanistan to Pakistan on a silver platter. I anticipate that within a couple of years, Afghanistan is going to be an all-out civil war. What will determine the pace of that happening will be whether or not the Americans continue funding the Afghan government. If it cuts off funding, then we're going to see that outcome happen sooner than later. But probably within 3 to 4 years, Afghanistan is going to be right back to where it was, which is actually going to reward Pakistan, right? Pakistan is already pretty emboldened by the moves that China has taken with respect to India over Doklam and other contestations. So I anticipate that when the Americans are no longer in Afghanistan, the pressure on Pakistan to even minimally suppress the jihadi activism in India is going to be taken away. And what Pakistan always is looking for to keep its jihadis on the leash and not targeting the state are attacks in Afghanistan and or India. So Pakistan is pretty much where it's going to be. The army is going to be in control. The public are going to be told that the jihadis are doing good work, and they will continue to support them. They'll continue to give their kids to these jihadi organizations. So Pakistan and its neighborhood, pretty straightforward. And I think I'll say that with a 95% degree of certitude. India, see, I am not as fearful for India as some. And the reason for that is its federalism, right? So in Pakistan, it was very easy to appropriate the educational system and put in this nonsense about evil Hindus and the great Muslim. It was very easy to do because of the over-centralization of the state. In India, that is not the case, right? For every state within the Indian Union, you have a state assembly. You have truly devolved ministries. Right. And so the BJP, they just can't storm in. And also at the state level, you have very local political parties, right? So the BJP might very well still may still retain its mastery at the national level. It still needs coalition partners, right? And people have a lot of choice at the level of the states. And the Supreme Court justices in India do not have that job forever. So even if they are today politically compromised, they have to retire at 60, right? So India, because of its genuine federalism and the democratization of politics, it's going to take a lot more than this, right? To make India what the BJP wants it to be. There will always be pockets of resistance. Caste, right? Low caste are not signing on to this because low caste are treated like crap in this BJP universe, as are women, right? So we're already seeing women protesting their exclusion from temples. So there is so much resistance to the BJP juggernaut, which in any event, draws from the Juggernaut temple, which has the square wheels on the chariot, right? In the United States, I'm much more afraid about the United States because what the scriptural literalists in the United States, basically the Republican Party has captured them.
And
yeah, but I would argue they're not really strict constitutionalists, right? So when I look at the Federalist Papers, I've read them like everyone else. I'm like, I don't actually think the Federalists would support this. I don't think the Federalists would truly support giving a corporation the same voice as a voting citizen, right? So what they call constitutionalism, what they, the Federalist Society, what it's really become is an elite capture of elites, right? Representing and aggregating the interests of the America's truly wealthy, while saying that they're doing this in the name of constitutionalism or originalism. But here's the other problem, and I'm not joking about this. The problem with our Constitution is that that the ordinary American cannot read it with comprehension. Right. It's very similar. I did this study
Right.
On again, Pakistanis. The people who knew most about Islam were least susceptible to radicalization because they could read the Quran with understanding and counter the ridiculous arguments of jihadist recruiters, which usually rely upon very poor exegesis of the Quran, right? There are very few Americans who support these justices who can read that Constitution with understanding, and therefore they take their word for it, right? And so, and our judiciary has been packed for the rest of my lifetime. We do not have regional parties in the United States, right? We should. I don't know why every other parliamentary democracy in the world does, but we don't. We have two parties. And the other thing that makes me very worried about the future of this country for the lifetime, I don't have kids. Otherwise, I would be, I don't know, I'd be moved. I would move already. Is that the most unrepresentative body of our parliament, which is the Senate, has all of the power, and that would be okay,
Right.
In a theoretical sense, if that minority were truly similar to the majority. But unfortunately, it's not. Whether you look at education, whether you look at their beliefs, it is a minority that wants to foist their very narrow scriptural literalism upon the rest of the country. And it's buttressed by other beliefs. I'm from the Midwest. Like, I'm from Indiana. Like, I am from what I call Talibanistan. And so when I go to Pakistan, I can't go back now, unfortunately. But whenever I would go and I would hang out with religious people there, I felt very much at home because the debates were the same, right? They would say the same thing. If you're an atheist, why is it you're not having affairs on your husband and all this stuff? But they also, this is nurtured by the corollary, which is also empirically incorrect, that the so-called elite arugula eaters are living off of them. But in fact, the reverse is true, right? The socialism is going in the other direction. The productive elites on the coast are subsidizing the less productive Americans in the middle. And their politicians routinely lie to them, and they're either unable to look at the real data, or they reject it if it's presented, or three, they just don't care. They prefer the myth, right? So I think we are really
Right.
we are in deep doo-doo.
In trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, there are two outcomes in 9 days, and in one outcome, I think the predictions can be quite straightforward for the future of democracy. In the other outcome, I think it's less certain. Even if you have a change in regime, I think it's if you take control of an aircraft at 5,000 feet, it's sometimes difficult to bring it back up again. So we'll see how it goes. But I think we are both agreeing, Christine, that the best thing we can do is to hang on.
That's not my view. I'm not enjoying this ride. It's like when you're on an airplane that's crashing. Well, I'm gonna enjoy the ride down. Oh, hell no! I'm gonna be screaming and pissing myself until I am unconscious and put out of my misery. But I have a lot of fears for the United States. We just don't have the institutional resilience that other parliamentary democracies that are going through this phase of white supremacy and authoritarianism, they'll bounce back because they don't have lifetime court appointments. They have more than 2 political parties, and they have politics that are different, right, at national and subnational levels. I mean, one potential solution to the American puzzle is, in fact, genuine federalism, which is we essentially have the rise of city-states, but what's fascinating, right, the conservatives who have long maintained, oh, no big government, we should have devolution of powers, they're the ones who are opposing this, right, because they see that we've already had city-states try to do this, right? Oh, no, you have to do this. And we're like, how about that whole federalism thing that you guys really, really loved when a Democrat was running the country, right? But I think that's really the only way forward, is that we have genuine devolution. And that the states, and so basically the states become a market, right? If I don't like living in Talibanistan, I can move. And the good news is that all of the jobs that are desirable are not in Talibanistan, right? So the Americans can sort themselves into the kind of communities in which they want to live. But my fear is that Trumpism has really eroded support for federalism, because they see that such genuine devolution is a way to undercut their authoritarianism when it comes to who can vote, for example. They do not want to leave that to city-states, right?
Yeah. So the only silver line in the whole nightmare for me is there is a significant demographic shift. If we survive through a period of, let's say, 5 to 10 years, the next generation appears to be in a much better position, both in terms of, their views, how they internalize information, how they analyze information. And so once our generation sort of check out, so to speak, things will improve. But the question is whether we are able to survive the transition of 5 to 10 years.
Yep. If
let's
not,
hope,
until the best materializes or not, there's always whiskey.
Yeah.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.